It was a cold night when a traveler arrived at a small, aging hotel located on a quiet street. The building looked ordinary from the outside, with a few dim lights glowing through its windows. Rain fell steadily and the streets were almost completely empty. The traveler had been driving for hours and was simply looking for a place to rest. When he stepped inside, the lobby was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no music, no background noise, just the faint sound of rain hitting the windows. At the front desk stood a receptionist who barely spoke, handing over a key without asking many questions. Everything felt normal, yet something about the atmosphere seemed slightly off. The receptionist avoided eye contact and spoke in a low, almost distant tone. When the traveler asked how long the hotel had been open, the receptionist paused briefly before answering in a vague manner. It was as if the question itself was unexpected. The key that was handed over was old, attached to a heavy metal tag with a number engraved on it. There was nothing unusual about the object itself, but the traveler noticed that the number seemed unfamiliar, almost out of sequence compared to the other room numbers listed behind the desk. Before he could ask more questions, the receptionist simply pointed toward the hallway and told him where to go. The hallway leading to the rooms was long and dimly lit. The lights flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The carpet beneath his feet was worn, and each step echoed more loudly than expected. As he walked deeper into the corridor, the hotel seemed unnaturally quiet. No doors opened, no voices could be heard, and there were no signs of other guests. The numbers on the doors passed by in sequence, but something felt wrong. The deeper he went, the more isolated he felt, as if the hallway itself stretched farther than it should have. When he finally reached his room, he hesitated before opening the door. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp. The air felt colder than expected, and there was a faint smell that he couldn't identify. The furniture was old but neatly arranged, as if it had been prepared recently. Everything appeared normal at first glance, yet something about the space felt wrong. It was not a visible detail, but rather a subtle feeling, as if the room did not belong in the same building. He stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him, unaware that this decision would lead to something he would never fully understand. As he looked around the room, he noticed small details that seemed out of place. The mirror on the wall reflected the room, but the angle appeared slightly distorted. The curtains moved gently, even though the window was closed. The silence inside the room was different from the hallway. It felt heavier, almost pressing against him. He tried to ignore the feeling and placed his belongings on the table. After hours of driving, exhaustion began to take over. Still, a strange sense of unease remained in the back of his mind, as if something in the room was quietly observing him. The traveler walked into the bathroom and stopped in front of the mirror. At first, everything looked normal. The sink, the tiles, the faint light above. But when he looked closer, something felt off. The reflection did not seem perfectly aligned with reality. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to create discomfort. He moved slightly, watching his reflection follow with a delay that was almost too small to detect. It could have been his imagination, a trick of the lighting or exhaustion. Still, the feeling lingered. The mirror seemed to show the room exactly as it was, yet at the same time, it felt like it was showing something else entirely. Returning to the main room, he noticed something strange about the bed. The sheets were no longer perfectly smooth. They appeared slightly wrinkled, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. He was certain he had not touched the bed yet. The air in the room felt colder now, and the silence had grown heavier. He stood still, trying to recall if he had accidentally brushed against the bed earlier. But the more he thought about it, the less certain he became. The idea that something had moved in the room without his awareness began to take hold, slowly turning unease into fear. He opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, hoping to find some sense of normality. But the corridor was just as empty as before. The lights flickered faintly, and the long stretch of carpet seemed to absorb every sound. He looked both directions, expecting to see another guest or hear movement, but there was nothing. The silence felt unnatural, as if the entire floor had been abandoned. For a moment, he considered returning to the front desk, but something about the hallway made him hesitate. It felt as though leaving the room would not make things any become better. Back inside the room, his attention returned to the key. It rested on the table where he had placed it earlier. The metal surface reflected the dim light, and the number engraved on it seemed oddly unfamiliar. He tried to remember the room number listed on the door, but for some reason he couldn't clearly recall it. The number on the key did not match anything he remembered seeing in the hallway. A sense of confusion began to grow. It was a small detail, but in a place where everything already felt wrong, even the smallest inconsistency became impossible to ignore. He approached the window and slowly pulled the curtain aside. Outside, the street was completely dark, with only faint reflections from distant lights. But something about the view felt strange. The angle did not seem to match the building's position. It was as if the window was showing a different perspective than it should have. He leaned closer, trying to understand what he was seeing. The reflection in the glass overlapped with the darkness outside, creating an image that was difficult to interpret. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement, but when he focused, there was nothing there. The light in the room began to flicker. At first, it was subtle, just a slight dimming and brightening. But then it became more noticeable, casting shifting shadows across the walls. The movement of those shadows created the illusion that something was changing in the room. He turned toward the source of the light, watching it carefully, trying to find a logical explanation. But the flickering did not follow any pattern. It was unpredictable, almost deliberate. Each shift in brightness seemed to reveal something new, something that had not been there before. One of the chairs in the room was no longer in the same position. He was certain of it. When he first entered, the chair had been facing the table. Now it was slightly turned toward the bed. The change was small but unmistakable. He stared at it, trying to convince himself that he had simply misremembered. But deep down, he knew that something had shifted. The idea that objects could move without explanation made the room feel even more oppressive. It was no longer just a place to rest. It had become something else entirely. The ticking of a clock suddenly caught his attention. He was sure he hadn't noticed it before. The sound echoed softly through the room, each tick slightly louder than the last. When he looked up at the wall, he saw an old clock hanging above the door. But something was wrong. The time displayed did not match his watch. It wasn't just a few minutes off, it was completely different. He checked again, comparing both times carefully. The longer he stared at it, the more disoriented he felt. Time, which should have been constant and reliable, now seemed uncertain. The ticking continued, steady and precise, as if marking something he could not understand. He stepped back into the hallway once more, determined to find the front desk. But this time something was different. The corridor seemed longer than before. The doors stretched endlessly in both directions, repeating in a pattern that didn't feel natural. He began walking, counting each door he passed. The numbers didn't make sense anymore. They skipped, repeated, and sometimes disappeared entirely. The deeper he went, the more it felt like the hallway was changing around him. Panic slowly began to build. This was no longer just an unsettling experience, it was something that defied logic entirely. When he finally turned back toward his room, he struggled to recognize it. The number on the door appeared faded, almost as if it had never been clearly printed. He moved closer, trying to read it, but the digits seemed to shift depending on the angle. For a moment, he wondered if he had come to the wrong door, but the layout of the hallway suggested otherwise. This was where his room should be. The uncertainty made his heart race. Something as simple as a room number should not be confusing. Yet here, even the smallest details refused to remain stable. Back inside the room, the darkness felt heavier than before. The lamp no longer provided enough light to fully illuminate the space. Shadows stretched across the walls, covering corners that had previously been visible. The air felt colder, almost suffocating. He tried to calm himself, reminding himself that exhaustion could distort perception. But the consistency of these changes made it difficult to dismiss them. Everything in the room seemed slightly altered, as if it were slowly shifting into something else. The sense of being watched grew stronger, even though there was no visible presence. Drawn back to the mirror, he hesitated before looking again. When he finally did, his reflection stood exactly where it should. But behind him, something seemed different. It was faint, almost impossible to see clearly, but it felt like there was an additional shape within the reflection. He turned quickly, but the room behind him was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the shape was gone. His breathing became heavier. The possibility that the mirror was showing something not present in reality was deeply unsettling. It suggested that whatever was happening in the room was not bound by normal rules. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a phone ringing. The old telephone on the bedside table vibrated slightly as it rang. The sound was sharp, cutting through the heavy stillness of the room. He stared at it, unsure whether to answer. The phone continued ringing, each tone more urgent than the last. Finally, he picked it up. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a faint sound, like breathing, echoed through the receiver. No voice, no words, just the presence of something on the other end. He slowly placed the phone back down, his hands shaking. The door to the room slowly creaked open on its own. The hallway beyond was darker than before, almost completely swallowed by shadow. He stood frozen, watching as the gap widened slightly. There was no wind, no visible force causing the movement. The silence outside was deeper than anything he had experienced before. It felt as if the entire building had become empty in a way that was impossible to explain. The open doorway no longer felt like an exit. Instead, it felt like an invitation into something unknown. Stepping into the hallway again, he realized that the environment had changed completely. The walls seemed darker, the space narrower, and the distance harder to judge. Every step felt uncertain. The familiar layout of the corridor was gone, replaced by something that felt distorted and unstable. He tried to remember the way back to the reception, but the directions no longer made sense. The hallway seemed to shift with every movement, making it impossible to navigate. The realization that he might not be able to leave began to take hold. After what felt like an endless walk, he finally reached the reception area, but it was empty. The desk stood in silence, with no sign of the receptionist. The lights flickered faintly, casting shadows across the room. The key rack behind the desk was still there, but the numbers on it seemed unfamiliar. He called out, hoping for a response, but his voice echoed back to him without answer. The place that once seemed quiet now felt completely abandoned. There was no one left to explain what was happening. When he finally managed to step outside, the street was completely empty. The rain had stopped, and the building behind him stood in total darkness. There were no lights in the windows, no sign that the hotel was even operating. He turned back for a moment, trying to understand what had just happened. But there was no clear answer. The experience felt unreal, like something that should not have been possible. Yet he knew it had happened. And the most unsettling part was this: there was no record that the room he stayed in had ever existed at all.